The fever had been burning through her body for 2 days. But when Helena Gibson collapsed beside the half-filled water trough that scorching afternoon in July 1877, Overseer Marcus Crane did not see a sick woman who needed help. He saw disobedience. Helena's vision blurred as she tried to push herself up from the dusty ground, her arms trembling with the effort. The sun beat down mercilessly on the work camp outside Chico, California, where she and dozens of other workers labored under contracts that felt more like chains. She had signed on 6 months ago, desperate for wages after her father's death left her with nothing but debts, and every day since had been harder than the last. But nothing compared to this moment, lying in the dirt with fire racing through her veins while Crane's boots appeared in her line of sight. "Get up," he said, his voice cold as winter despite the 100-degree heat. "You have 3 more hours before the bell." "I cannot," Helena whispered, her throat raw and aching. "Please, I need to rest. Just an hour." She heard rather than saw him walk away, and for a blessed moment she thought he might show mercy. Then she heard the unmistakable sound of leather uncoiling, the whisper of the whip he kept at his belt, and her heart seized with terror. "No one rests," Crane said, returning to stand over her. "Especially not lazy women who think tears will buy them special treatment." Helena tried to crawl away, but her limbs would not obey. The first strike came across her back, and she cried out, the pain somehow cutting through even the haze of fever. The second strike followed immediately after, and she curled into herself, trying to protect her body from the assault. That was when she heard the thunder of hooves and a shout that seemed to shake the very air. "Drop it!" Garrett Owens had been riding past the work camp on his way back to his ranch when he heard the scream. He had never been the kind of man to ignore someone in distress, a trait his late mother had instilled in him from boyhood, and he spurred his horse toward the sound without a second thought. What he found made his blood turn to ice. A woman lay on the ground, her homespun dress torn and dirty, while a man stood over her with a raised whip. Garrett did not wait for explanations. He drove his horse between them, dismounted in one fluid motion, and caught the whip mid-strike with his bare hand. The leather bit into his palm, but he barely felt it through the rage that had overtaken him. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" Garrett demanded, his gray eyes boring into the overseer's face. Crane tried to yank the whip free, but Garrett held firm. "This is none of your business, Cowboy. This woman is under contract to work and she refuses." Garrett looked down at Helena, really looked at her and saw the flush of fever on her cheeks, the way her body shook even in the brutal heat. "She is sick, you bastard." "She is lazy," Crane spat back. "Now let go of my property before I have you arrested for interfering with legal business." Instead of releasing the whip, Garrett wrapped the leather around his hand twice, and pulled with all his considerable strength. Crane stumbled forward, and Garrett used the momentum to wrench the whip completely from his grasp. Then, with deliberate precision, he brought his knee up and broke the handle clean in half over it. The crack echoed across the camp, and suddenly there were dozens of eyes watching from the fields and workstations. "Your business is done," Garrett said quietly, but there was steel in his voice that made even Crane take a step back. "This woman is coming with me." "You cannot just take her," Crane protested, though his bluster had faded considerably. "She owes 6 more months on her contract." Garrett reached into his vest and pulled out a leather wallet. "How much?" "What? How much does she owe? I will buy out her contract right now." Crane's eyes gleamed with greed, and he named a sum that was easily twice what Helena's labor could be worth. Garrett counted out the bills without hesitation and thrust them at the overseer. "Now she is free to go. If I ever hear of you laying a hand on another worker, legal contract or not, I will come back and we will finish this conversation properly. Do you understand me? The overseer snatched the money and backed away, muttering curses, but he did not argue further. Garrett knelt beside Helena, his anger transforming into concern as he saw how ill she truly was. "Can you hear me?" he asked gently, touching her shoulder with careful fingers. Helena's eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at him with confusion and fear warring in her feverish gaze. "Who are you?" "My name is Garrett Owens. I am going to take you somewhere safe where you can rest and heal. Do you trust me?" She should not trust him. She did not know him, but something in his face, in the genuine worry she saw there, made her nod weakly. "Yes." He lifted her as though she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest as he mounted his horse with the ease of a man who had spent his whole life in the saddle. Helena's head lolled against his shoulder, and she felt the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek as consciousness began to slip away. "Stay with me," Garrett said, his voice close to her ear. "Just stay with me a little longer. My ranch is not far." She tried to answer, but darkness was pulling her down, and she surrendered to it with a sigh. Garrett rode hard for home, one arm locked around the sick woman while the other guided his horse along the familiar path. His ranch lay 5 miles north of Chico, a spread of 300 acres that he had built up over the past 8 years through backbreaking work and careful management. He had wranglers who worked for him, good men who earned fair wages and were treated with respect, but he lived alone in the main house, a fact his friends often teased him about. "You need a wife, Garrett," they would say. "A man should not live his life alone." He had never found the right woman, never felt the spark that his parents had shared before his father's death in a cattle drive accident. Garrett had been only 15 then, and he had watched his mother grieve herself into an early grave within 2 years. The pain of that loss had made him wary of opening his heart, though he had never lacked for female attention. At 26, he was considered one of the most eligible bachelors in the county, with his tall frame, strong features, and the success of his ranch to recommend him. None of that mattered now as he carried a dying woman into his home and laid her on his own bed. He shouted for Rosie, his housekeeper, a Mexican woman in her 50s who had helped raise him after his mother's death. "Dios mío," Rosie breathed when she saw Helena. "What happened?" "Fever and a whipping from that bastard overseer at the work camp," Garrett said grimly. "She needs cool water, clean bandages, and whatever medicines you have. I am going to ride for Doc Matthews." "Go," Rosie said, already moving to Helena's side. "I will take care of her." The doctor arrived within the hour, a gruff man in his 60s who had seen everything the frontier could throw at a person. He examined Helena thoroughly while Garrett paced outside the bedroom door like a caged wolf. "She has pneumonia," Doc Matthews announced when he finally emerged. "The fever is bad, and those wounds on her back could fester if we are not careful. The next few days will tell us whether she pulls through." "She will pull through," Garrett said with a certainty he did not entirely feel. "What do we need to do?" For 3 days and nights, Garrett barely left Helena's side. Rosie tried to shoo him away, telling him it was not proper for an unmarried man to tend to an unmarried woman in such a state, but he refused to go. He bathed Helena's burning skin with cool cloths, coaxed water and broth past her lips when she was conscious enough to swallow, and changed the dressings on her back with a gentleness that surprised even himself. During those long hours, he learned her name from the papers he found in her small bag of belongings that someone from the camp had sent over. Helena Gibson, age 22, born in San Francisco and orphaned just 6 months prior. The same papers showed the cruel terms of her work contract, the pittance she had been earning, and the debt that had driven her into such desperate circumstances. "You will never go back to that," Garrett murmured to her unconscious form. "I promise you that." On the fourth day, Helena's fever finally broke. Garrett was dozing in a chair beside the bed when he heard her voice, weak but clear. "Water, please." His eyes flew open, and he was at her side in an instant, lifting a cup to her lips and supporting her head as she drank. She took small sips at first, then longer ones, and when she was finished she looked at him with true awareness for the first time since he had found her. "You are the man who saved me," she said. "I am Garrett Owens, and yes. Why did you help me? You did not know me." He sat back down in his chair, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was, how his clothes were rumpled and his jaw was covered in several days' worth of stubble. Because it was the right thing to do, because no one deserves to be treated the way that man was treating you. Tears welled up in Helena's eyes and spilled down her cheeks. "He broke my contract. I bought it out. You are free." She began to sob then, great shuddering sobs that shook her whole body, and Garrett did not know what to do except take her hand and hold it while she cried. When the storm of emotion finally passed, she wiped her eyes with her free hand but did not pull away from his grip. "Thank you," she whispered. "I will repay you somehow. I will work for you, do whatever you need until the debt is settled." "There is no debt," Garrett said firmly. "You owe me nothing. But the money you paid was mine to spend as I saw fit. You were in trouble and I helped. That is all there is to it." Helena looked at him with wonder, as though she could not quite believe such a man existed. "I do not even know what to say." "Then do not say anything. Just rest and heal. Everything else can wait." Over the following weeks, Helena grew stronger. Rosie fussed over her like a mother hen, bringing her hearty meals and helping her bathe and dress until she could manage on her own. The wounds on her back healed slowly, leaving scars that would never fully fade, but the pneumonia released its grip, and her lungs cleared. Throughout it all, Garrett visited her every day, sometimes multiple times, always with an excuse about needing to check on her progress or discuss something with Rosie. But Helena began to suspect he simply wanted to see her. She found herself looking forward to his visits with an eagerness that both thrilled and frightened her. He was unlike any man she had ever known. He spoke to her as an equal, asked her opinions on everything from politics to books to the running of the ranch, and listened to her answers with genuine interest. He had a library in his house, dozens of books that his mother had collected, and he brought them to her one by one during her recovery. "I never had much time for schooling," Helena admitted one afternoon as she sat up in bed with a novel in her lap. "My mother died when I was young and my father needed me to work. I can read, but not well." "Would you like to improve?" Garrett asked, settling into his usual chair beside the bed. "I would, but I would not want to trouble you." "It would not be trouble. I could teach you if you wanted. My mother taught me to love reading, and I would be happy to pass that gift along." So began a new routine. Every evening after dinner, Garrett would sit with Helena, and they would read together. Sometimes he would read aloud to her, his deep voice bringing stories to life in a way that made her forget where she was. Other times she would read to him, stumbling over difficult words while he patiently helped her sound them out. It was during these quiet hours that Helena began to fall in love, though she tried desperately to fight it. She had nothing to offer him. She was poor, scarred, and still recovering from an ordeal that had nearly killed her. Garrett Owens was a successful rancher, respected in the community, who could have his pick of proper young women from good families. What could he possibly want with someone like her? But the way he looked at her sometimes, with a softness in his gray eyes that made her breath catch, gave her hope despite her better judgment. Garrett was having similar thoughts, though he expressed them only to his horse during long rides across his property. He had not planned on falling for Helena Gibson. He had only meant to help her, to do the decent thing and then send her on her way once she was well. But somewhere between the fear of losing her during those first desperate days and the joy of watching her laugh at a passage in a book, his heart had made its own decision. She was beautiful, though he suspected she did not realize it. Her dark hair had regained its luster as her health returned, falling in waves past her shoulders when she let it down. Her brown eyes held depths of strength and kindness that drew him like a moth to flame. And her spirit, the sheer determination she showed in recovering from her ordeal and rebuilding her life, humbled him. But he did not know if she could ever feel the same way about him. He had saved her, yes, but did gratitude have to mean affection? He would not pressure her, would not use the debt she felt she owed him to manipulate her into anything. If she wanted to leave once she was fully healed, he would help her find a respectable position somewhere safe, even if the thought of her leaving made his chest ache. 2 months after the day he had broken the overseer's whip, Helena was well enough to move around the house freely. Rosie had found her some proper dresses, second-hand but in good condition, and Helena insisted on helping with household tasks despite Garrett's protests that she should rest as long as she needed. "I cannot lie about forever," she told him over breakfast one morning. "I need to do something useful, need to earn my keep." "You are a guest in this house," Garrett said for what felt like the 100th time. "Guests do not need to earn their keep. But I cannot be a guest forever. Eventually I will need to make my own way. Perhaps I could find work in Chico, something in a shop or no." The word came out more forcefully than Garrett had intended, and Helena looked at him in surprise. He took a breath and moderated his tone. "What I mean is, you do not need to rush into anything. If you want to work, there is plenty to do here. Rosie could use help with the cooking and cleaning, and I have been meaning to hire someone to manage my account books because I am terrible at it. But if you want something else, we can figure that out too. You would hire me to manage your accounts if you wanted, unless you would rather do something else." Helena bit her lip, thinking. The truth was, she did not want to leave this ranch. She had come to love the peace of it, the way the sun rose over the eastern pastures and painted everything gold, the sound of cattle lowing in the distance, even the smell of hay and leather that seemed to permeate everything. But most of all, she did not want to leave Garrett. "I would like to stay," she said quietly, "if you truly do not mind." The smile that broke across Garrett's face was like sunrise. "I do not mind at all. In fact, I would be glad of it." So Helena became part of the household officially, though Garrett insisted on paying her far more than any housekeeper would normally earn. She took over the account books and discovered she had a knack for numbers, organizing his finances in a way that made him shake his head in wonder. She also helped Rosie in the kitchen, learning to cook the hearty meals that the ranch hands expected. And slowly the house began to feel like a home in a way it had not since Garrett's mother died. The ranch hands noticed the change in their boss, too. He whistled while he worked, smiled more readily, and seemed to have a new energy that made him even more effective than before. When one of the older hands, a man named Charlie, asked him about the woman living in the main house, Garrett's face softened in a way that told Charlie everything he needed to know. "She is special," Garrett said simply. "Real special." "Then why do you not tell her so?" Charlie asked. "Man does not look at a woman the way you look at her unless he is in love. It is complicated. It is always complicated, but life is short, boss. You of all people should know that." Garrett did know that. He had watched both his parents die young, had seen friends and neighbors cut down by disease, accidents, and violence. The frontier was not a place for hesitation, not if you wanted to truly live. But the thought of confessing his feelings to Helena, and seeing rejection in her eyes terrified him in a way that nothing else ever had. Autumn came to Chico with cooler temperatures and the first hints of rain. Helena had been living at the ranch for 4 months, and the easy companionship between her and Garrett had deepened into something neither of them could ignore much longer. They found excuses to be near each other, their hands brushing during past dishes at dinner, their shoulders touching when they sat together reading in the evenings. Rosie watched it all with knowing eyes and prayed they would both find the courage to speak their hearts soon. The moment came on an October evening when Garrett and Helena were sitting on the porch watching the sun set. They had just finished reading a chapter from a novel about star-crossed lovers, and the romantic tale had left them both feeling contemplative. "You think love like that really exists?" Helena asked, her eyes on the horizon where purple and orange clouds painted the sky. "The kind that makes people risk everything?" Garrett was quiet for a long moment, and when Helena glanced at him, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. "Yes," he said finally. "I do. Have you ever felt it?" He held her gaze, and in that moment Helena saw the truth written plainly in his eyes, her breath caught in her throat. "I am feeling it now," Garrett said, his voice rough with emotion. "I have been feeling it for months, but I did not know how to tell you. I did not want you to think I was taking advantage, that I expected anything from you because of what happened." "Garrett," Helena whispered, but she did not know what else to say. He reached out and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I know I should have proper words for this, should probably ask your father for permission if he were alive and do everything according to custom. But the truth is simple. I love you, Helena Gibson. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you have brought life back into this house. I love your laugh and your stubbornness and the way you concentrate when you are working on the account books. I love everything about you, and if you do not feel the same way, then I will respect that and never mention it again. But I had to tell you. I had to let you know." Tears were streaming down Helena's face, but she was smiling through them. "You foolish man," she said, her voice breaking. "How could you think I do not feel the same way? I have been in love with you since you sat by my bedside and read to me when I was too weak to hold a book myself. I have been in love with you through every kindness you have shown me, every moment we have spent together. I love you so much it frightens me because I never thought I could have something this good, this true." Garrett made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and pulled her into his arms. She went willingly, burying her face in his chest while he held her close, his chin resting on top of her head. They stayed like that for a long time, just holding each other while the sun finished setting and the first stars appeared overhead. When they finally pulled apart, Garrett cupped Helena's face in his hands and looked at her with such tenderness that she felt she might melt. "May I kiss you?" he asked. "Yes," she breathed. "Please." His lips met hers softly at first, almost tentatively, as though he was afraid she might disappear. But when Helena responded, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, the kiss deepened into something more passionate, more certain. It was a kiss that spoke of promises and future, of two lonely souls finally finding their home in each other. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Garrett rested his forehead against Helena's and laughed with pure joy. "Will you marry me?" he asked. "I know this is fast, and if you want to wait I will understand, but I have to ask because I do not want to spend another day without knowing you will be mine." "Yes," Helena said without hesitation. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married 6 weeks later in a small ceremony at the church in Chico. Helena wore a dress of pale blue silk that Garrett insisted on buying for her from the finest seamstress in town, and she carried wildflowers that Rosie had gathered that morning. Garrett wore his best suit and could not stop smiling the entire day. The ranch hands came, as did several of Garrett's friends and neighbors, and even Doc Matthews attended, looking pleased to see his patient not just surviving but thriving. The only shadow on the day came when they passed the work camp on their way back to the ranch after the ceremony. Helena saw it through the window of the wagon and instinctively moved closer to Garrett on the seat. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. "He cannot hurt you any more," Garrett murmured against her hair. "I will never let anyone hurt you again." "I know," Helena said, "but I think of the others still there, the ones who do not have someone to save them." Garrett was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I have been thinking about that too. What if we did something about it?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if we went to the territorial governor or the newspapers or whoever will listen and told them what is happening in those camps? You have first-hand experience. Your testimony could make a difference." Helena considered this, then nodded slowly. "I would like that. I would like to help if I can." They spent their wedding night in the house that was now officially Helena's home, and it was everything a first night together should be. Garrett was patient and tender, guiding Helena through her nervousness with gentle words and gentler touches. When they finally came together completely, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, a physical expression of the love that had already bound their hearts. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the darkness with only moonlight streaming through the window, Helena traced idle patterns on Garrett's chest and marveled at how much her life had changed. "5 months ago I was dying in the dirt," she said softly. "Now I am here, married to the best man I have ever known. It does not seem real." Garrett caught her hand and brought it to his lips, kissing her knuckles. "It is real. This is your life now, our life, and I promise I will spend every day making sure you never regret saying yes to me." "I could never regret it," Helena said, tilting her head up to kiss him. "You are everything I never dared to dream of." They made love again, slower this time, learning each other's bodies and hearts in the intimate darkness. And when they finally fell asleep in each other's arms, both were smiling. True to their discussion, Garrett and Helena began working to expose the conditions in the work camps. They traveled to Sacramento to meet with government officials, bringing with them Helena's testimony and the testimonies of other workers who had escaped similar situations. The process was frustratingly slow, mired in bureaucracy and the reluctance of wealthy men to acknowledge that the cheap labor they profited from came at such a high human cost. But Garrett and Helena were persistent. They wrote letters to newspapers, gave interviews, and slowly began to build public support for reform. It took nearly a year, but eventually new laws were passed regulating work camps, requiring better conditions, fair wages, and limiting the terms of labor contracts. It was not everything they had hoped for, but it was a start. During that year, their love only grew stronger. They worked side by side on the ranch, with Helena taking on more and more responsibility for managing the business side while Garrett focused on the physical labor. They made a formidable team, and the ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Rosie watched them with satisfaction, seeing how they complemented each other perfectly. Garrett tempered Helena's occasional impulsiveness with steady practicality, while Helena drew Garrett out of the solitude he had lived in for so long. They laughed together often, whether they were mucking out stalls or doing the account books, or simply sitting together at the end of a long day. On their first anniversary, Garrett gave Helena a beautiful mare, dappled gray with intelligent eyes. "So you can ride with me," he said. "I want to show you every corner of this land we share." Helena learned to ride under his patient instruction, and soon they were taking long rides together across the ranch and beyond, exploring the hills and valleys around Chico. During one of these rides, they came across an abandoned cabin on the far edge of Garrett's property, and Helena declared it would be perfect as a line shack for the ranch hands working the distant pastures. They spent weeks fixing it up together, and it became a running joke between them about whose idea for improvement was better. 2 years after their marriage, Helena realized she was pregnant. She told Garrett one evening as they were getting ready for bed, and the look of joy on his face was something she would treasure forever. "A baby," he said, pulling her into his arms. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Helena asked, though she could see the answer in his eyes. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Garrett said, kissing her soundly. "You have made me the luckiest man alive." The pregnancy was not easy. Helena suffered from terrible morning sickness in the first months, and as she grew larger, she found it increasingly difficult to manage the physical demands of ranch life. Garrett hovered over her anxiously, trying to make her rest more, but Helena was stubborn about maintaining her routines. "I am pregnant, not dying," she told him after he tried to ban her from the barn. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time while still working. I will not spend 9 months as an invalid." But she did slow down eventually as her belly grew and her back ached. Garrett took over more of her usual tasks without complaint, and Rosie fussed over her even more than usual, making sure she ate properly and got enough rest. On a warm spring morning in 1880, Helena went into labor. Garrett sent one of the hands racing for Doc Matthews while he stayed by Helena's side, holding her hand through the contractions and trying to hide his own terror. He had helped deliver countless calves and foals, but this was different. This was Helena, his whole world, and the thought of something going wrong made him physically ill. Doc Matthews arrived in time to oversee the birth, and after 10 hours of labor that felt like eternity to everyone involved, Helena delivered a healthy baby boy. Garrett wept openly when the doctor placed his son in his arms, awed by the tiny, perfect features and the strength of the infant's grip when he wrapped his little hand around Garrett's finger. "He is beautiful," Garrett said, his voice choked with emotion. "He is perfect. What should we name him?" Helena asked, exhausted but smiling from the bed. They had discussed names during the pregnancy but had not settled on anything definite. Now, looking at his son's face, Garrett knew exactly what felt right. "Thomas," he said. "After your father, Thomas Gibson Owens." Helena's eyes filled with tears. "Yes," she whispered. "That is perfect." Thomas was a healthy, hungry baby who quickly had the entire household wrapped around his tiny fingers. Garrett proved to be a doting father, getting up for night feedings and changings without complaint, rocking his son for hours when he was fussy, and narrating everything he did on the ranch as though the baby could understand. "Your father has lost his mind," Helena told Thomas with amusement one afternoon, watching as Garrett showed the 3-month-old how to properly mend a fence. "But we love him anyway." Life settled into a new rhythm with the baby. The ranch continued to thrive, and Garrett hired additional help so that he and Helena could spend more time with their son. They watched with wonder as Thomas grew, celebrating every milestone as though it was the greatest achievement in history. When Thomas was a year old, Helena became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and she delivered a daughter they named Mary after Garrett's mother. Mary had her father's gray eyes and her mother's dark hair, and she was the most content baby anyone had ever seen, rarely crying and always ready with a smile. The years passed in a blur of happiness. Thomas grew into a sturdy boy who followed his father everywhere, wanting to help with every ranch task whether he was big enough or not. Mary was quieter but just as determined, and she had a way with animals that reminded Garrett of his own mother. Garrett and Helena often reflected on how far they had come from that terrible day when he had found her being whipped. Sometimes Helena would wake from nightmares about it, but Garrett was always there to hold her until the fear passed. "You saved me," she told him one night after such a dream. "In every way a person can be saved. You saved me too," Garrett replied, kissing her forehead. "I was just existing before you came into my life. You taught me how to truly live." When Thomas was 5 and Mary was 3, Helena gave birth to twin boys they named James and Samuel. The twins were a handful from the start, always getting into mischief and keeping everyone on their toes. But they filled the house with laughter and joy, and Garrett built an addition onto the house to accommodate their growing family. The ranch continued to prosper, becoming one of the most successful in the region. Garrett's fair treatment of his workers became legendary, and he always had men willing to work for him. He and Helena made a point of checking in with each worker individually, making sure they were treated well and paid fairly, determined that no one on their land would ever suffer the way Helena had suffered. As the children grew older, Garrett and Helena made sure to teach them about what had happened, about the importance of standing up for those who could not stand up for themselves. They took the children with them when they continued their advocacy work, wanting them to understand that privilege came with responsibility. Thomas proved to have his father's sense of justice and his mother's head for business. Mary was gentle but fierce when defending those she loved. James and Samuel were inseparable, two halves of a whole who balanced each other perfectly. On their 10th anniversary, Garrett took Helena back to the spot where he had first kissed her on the porch. The children were spending the night with Rosie, giving them a rare evening alone. 10 years, Garrett said, pulling Helena into his arms. "It feels like yesterday and forever all at once." "Do you have any regrets?" Helena asked, though she knew the answer. "Not a single one. Best decision I ever made was breaking that whip and taking you home with me." Helena laughed. "I seem to remember you bought out my contract first. Best money I ever spent then." Garrett grew serious, cupping her face in his hands the way he had that first time. "I love you, Helena, more now than I did then, which I would not have thought possible. You are my heart, my home, my everything." "And you are mine," Helena said, tears of joy streaming down her face, "forever and always." They renewed their vows in a private ceremony the next day with just family and close friends present. Watching them, no one would ever guess the violence and desperation that had brought them together. They looked like what they were, two people utterly and completely in love, committed to building a life together no matter what challenges came their way. The children grew and eventually began to build lives of their own. Thomas took over more responsibility on the ranch, proving to be as capable as his father. Mary discovered a passion for teaching and opened a school on the ranch property for the workers' children. James and Samuel decided to study law together, inspired by their parents' advocacy work and determined to continue fighting for justice. Through it all, Garrett and Helena remained each other's anchor. They still took long rides together when they could steal away, still read together in the evenings, still looked at each other with the same love and wonder they had felt those first days. They were partners in every sense of the word, weathering the storms of life together and celebrating the joys. When Garrett turned 50, he finally convinced Helena to take a trip back to San Francisco, where she had not been since her father's death so many years before. It was bittersweet, visiting the places of her childhood, but Garrett was with her through every memory, holding her hand and reminding her of how far she had come. "That girl who left here alone and afraid," Garrett said as they stood looking at the house where Helena had grown up. "She became the strongest woman I know. She survived things that would have broken other people, and she built a life worth living. You should be proud of her." "I am," Helena said softly, "but I could not have done it without you. We did it together," Garrett corrected. "Everything we have, everything we are, we built together." They returned to the ranch renewed, ready for whatever years remained to them. Garrett's hair was more silver than brown now, and Helena had laugh lines around her eyes, but they were as in love as ever. They watched their children marry and start families of their own, delighting in each new grandchild that came along. On summer evenings, when the work was done and the ranch was quiet, they would sit on that same porch where they had first confessed their love. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they simply enjoyed each other's presence, but always they were together. "Tell me again," Helena said one such evening, her head resting on Garrett's shoulder. "Tell me about the day we met." Garrett smiled. He had told this story countless times over the years, to their children and grandchildren, to friends and strangers, but he never tired of it. "It was the hottest day of the summer," he began, his voice carrying the cadence of a tale told many times but always with fresh emotion. "And I was riding past that cursed work camp when I heard a scream that made my blood run cold." He told her about racing toward the sound, about seeing her on the ground with the whip raised above her, about the rage that had overcome him. He told her about catching the whip and breaking it, about buying her freedom and carrying her home. "I did not know then that I was carrying my entire future in my arms," Garrett said, pressing a kiss to Helena's temple. "Did not know that the sick woman I was trying to save would end up saving me right back. It was the fever," Helena teased, as she always did at this point in the story. "I was clearly delirious, or I never would have agreed to go with a strange man." "Best delirium of your life," Garrett shot back, and they both laughed. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of the ranch settling down for the night, the lowing of cattle, the whinny of horses, the voices of the hands calling to each other as they finished their work. "You think we made a difference?" Helena asked suddenly. "With the work camp reforms, with the way we have run this ranch, with raising our children to care about justice. Do you think any of it mattered?" Garrett considered the question seriously, as he always did when Helena asked something important. "I think every act of kindness matters," he said finally. "Every time we chose compassion over cruelty, fairness over exploitation, love over indifference. Maybe we did not change the whole world, but we changed our corner of it, and we raised children who will continue that work. That has to count for something." "It does," Helena agreed. "It counts for everything." As the stars began to appear overhead, one by one like distant candles being lit, Garrett tightened his arm around his wife and thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. If someone had told him that hot July day in 1877 that the sick woman he was rescuing would become the love of his life, the mother of his children, and his partner in building something meaningful, he would not have believed them. But life had a way of surprising you, of taking broken pieces and making them into something beautiful. Helena's thoughts were running along similar lines. She thought about the girl she had been, desperate and alone, signing away her freedom for the promise of wages that would never be enough to escape. She thought about lying in the dirt with fever burning through her, certain she was going to die in that terrible place. And then she thought about the moment Garrett had appeared, like something out of a story, breaking the instrument of her torture and carrying her to safety. Everything good in her life had flowed from that moment. Her husband, her children, her home, the purpose she had found in fighting for others who suffered as she had suffered. All of it traced back to a stranger who had refused to ride past someone in need, who had seen her humanity when others saw only a piece of property to be exploited. "What are you thinking about?" Garrett asked, sensing the emotion in her silence. "That I am the luckiest woman alive," Helena said simply. "That I get to spend my life with a man who broke a whip instead of walking away. That we built this together, this beautiful life, from the ashes of the worst moment of my existence." "Not just you," Garrett said softly. "I am the lucky one. You brought light and laughter and love into a house that had been dark for too long. You gave me a family, a purpose beyond just surviving from one day to the next. You made me want to be better, to do better, to leave this world a little kinder than I found it." They kissed then, a long, slow kiss that held decades of love and trust and partnership. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling through tears. "Come on," Garrett said, standing and offering Helena his hand. "Let us go inside. I believe we have some grandchildren stopping by tomorrow, and you know how early they arrive." Helena took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. They walked into the house together, fingers intertwined, the way they had walked through life for more than 20 years. The house that had once been so quiet now echoed with the sounds of family. Portraits lined the walls, showing Thomas and his wife Sarah with their 3 children, Mary and her husband Robert with their 2 daughters, James and his wife Elizabeth with their newborn son, Samuel and his wife Catherine with twin girls on the way. The legacy Garrett and Helena had built together, written in the faces of the people they loved most. That night, as they lay in bed together, Helena traced the familiar contours of Garrett's face in the darkness. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For everything. For saving me, for loving me, for building this life with me, for being exactly who you are." Garrett captured her hand and kissed her palm. "Thank you for letting me love you, for choosing me every day even when you had every reason to close your heart, for being my partner and my best friend. I would do it all again in a heartbeat, every single moment." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, the way they had every night for more than 2 decades. And if either of them dreamed, it was of sunshine and open spaces, of children's laughter and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived, of a love that had started with an act of courage and grown into something eternal. Years continued to pass, marked by seasons and harvests and the milestones of their growing family. Garrett taught his grandsons to ride the way he had taught their fathers, patient and encouraging, while Helena taught her granddaughters to read and manage accounts, passing along the skills Garrett had once taught her. They never forgot where they had come from, and they never let their children or grandchildren forget either. The broken pieces of the whip that Garrett had snapped across his knee that fateful day were kept in a place of honor in the house, a reminder of the moment that had changed everything. When the grandchildren asked about it, as they inevitably did, Garrett and Helena would tell them the story, making sure they understood the importance of standing up for what was right even when it was difficult or dangerous. The work camp where Helena had suffered was long gone, replaced by fair employment practices and workers' rights that she and Garrett had helped to establish. But the legacy of that fight lived on in the way they ran their ranch, in the advocacy work their children continued, and in the values they instilled in the next generation. On their 25th anniversary, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. There were 40 people crowding the house and yard, multiple generations of Owenses who owed their very existence to a cowboy who had refused to look away from injustice, and a woman who had survived the unsurvivable. Thomas stood to make a toast. His own children gathered around him. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who taught us that love is not just a feeling but an action, that it means standing up for those who cannot stand up for themselves, that it means building something lasting and passing it on to those who come after. Everything we are, everything we have, we owe to the 2 of you. Mary added her own words. You showed us that the worst moments of our lives do not have to define us, that we can take pain and transform it into purpose. Thank you for being our example, our teachers, and our inspiration. James and Samuel spoke together, as they did most things. You taught us to fight for justice, to never accept cruelty as inevitable, to use whatever advantages we have to help those who have none. The work you started is not finished, and we promise to carry it forward. Through it all, Garrett and Helena sat together, hands clasped, tears streaming down their faces. They looked at each other and saw not just who they were now, gray-haired and lined with age, but who they had been, the young man and woman who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and chosen to build something beautiful from the ruins. When it was their turn to speak, Garrett stood and pulled Helena up beside him. I am not much for speeches, he said, his voice rough with emotion. But I want you all to know how grateful I am for this family, for this life. None of it would exist if I had ridden past the work camp that day. And I thank God every day that I did not. He turned to Helena, speaking to her directly though everyone was listening. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. You made me a better man, a better father, a better person. Every day with you has been a gift, and I would not trade a single moment of it for anything. Helena could barely speak through her tears, but she managed. You saved my life, and then you gave me a reason to live it. You loved me when I had nothing to offer, and you have stood beside me through everything. I love you more than words can say, and I always will. They kissed while their family cheered and applauded, and the celebration continued late into the night, filled with laughter and music, and the joy of people who knew they were loved. More years passed, bringing the inevitable changes that time always brings. Rosie passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 85, leaving a hole in their lives, but also a legacy of kindness and wisdom that had shaped their entire family. Doc Matthews followed not long after, having delivered most of the Owens grandchildren and some of the great-grandchildren into the world. Garrett slowed down gradually, his body no longer able to do all the physical labor he had once tackled without thought. But Thomas had fully taken over the day-to-day operations of the ranch, running it with the same integrity his father had shown. Garrett spent his time mentoring his grandchildren, passing along stories and skills, making sure they understood the history they carried. Helena developed arthritis in her hands, making it difficult to manage the detailed account work she had once loved. But Mary's daughters were eager to learn from her, and she taught them everything she knew about business and advocacy, and the importance of using their voices for those who had none. On their 40th anniversary, Garrett and Helena took a ride together across the ranch, just the two of them as they had done so many times before. They rode slowly, their horses walking side by side, taking in the land they had built their lives upon. 40 years, Helena said wonderingly. Where did the time go? Into this, Garrett said, gesturing at the ranch spread out before them. Into our children and grandchildren, into making a difference. I would not call it time lost. No, Helena agreed. Time well spent. They stopped at the spot where the old line shack still stood, the one they had renovated together in the early years of their marriage. It was well maintained now by Thomas's crew, but it still held memories of stolen moments and whispered dreams. You remember when we fixed this place up? Garrett asked. You insisted we needed a stove even though I said a fireplace was enough. And I was right, Helena said with a smile. The stove was much more practical. You were right about a lot of things, Garrett admitted. Most things, really. They dismounted and went inside, finding it just as cozy as it had been decades ago. They sat together on the bench by the window, looking out at the land, and talked about everything and nothing, the way couples who have spent a lifetime together can do. "If you could go back," Helena asked, "knowing everything that would happen, would you still break that whip, still buy my freedom?" Garrett looked at her incredulously. "Are you seriously asking me that? I want to hear you say it." "Yes," Garrett said emphatically. 1,000 times yes. 1,000,000 times yes. Every decision I have ever made, every path I have taken, has led me to this moment right here with you. I would not change a thing." Helena leaned her head on his shoulder, content. "Good, because I feel the same way." They stayed until sunset, watching the light change across the land they loved, then rode slowly back to the house where their family was gathering for the anniversary dinner. Their children and grandchildren and now great-grandchildren had descended on the ranch, turning it into a chaos of noise and love that made both Garrett and Helena's hearts sing. That night, surrounded by the family they had created, Garrett and Helena renewed their vows one final time. Thomas's son, now a minister, performed the ceremony, reading from the same Bible that had been used at their original wedding. "Do you, Garrett Owens, take Helena to be your wife, to love and cherish for however many days you are given?" "I do," Garrett said firmly, his eyes locked on Helena's face. "Forever and always." "And do you, Helena Owens, take Garrett to be your husband, to love and cherish for however many days you are given?" "I do," Helena said, her voice strong and clear. "Forever and always." They exchanged new rings, simple gold bands inscribed with the date of their first wedding and this one, 40 years apart. And when they kissed, it was with the same passion and promise they had shared as young newlyweds. The party that followed was joyous and loud, with multiple generations dancing and celebrating the love that had created them all. Looking around the room, seeing the faces of the people who existed because a cowboy had chosen to intervene, because a sick woman had chosen to trust a stranger, was almost overwhelming. Late that night, after everyone had finally gone to bed, Garrett and Helena sat on their porch one more time, reluctant to let the day end. "Thank you for 40 years, Garrett said quietly. "Thank you for 40 years, Helena echoed, "and however many more we get." They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the stars wheel overhead. The sounds of the ranch at night were as familiar as their own heartbeats, a symphony they had been listening to for decades. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the moon. Closer by, one of the horses whinnied softly in the barn. The wind whispered through the trees that Helena had planted years ago, now tall and strong. "You know what I realized today?" Helena said suddenly. "What? That we did it. We really did it. We built a life from nothing, from a moment of violence and desperation, and turned it into all of this, into love and family and purpose, into something that will outlast us both." Garrett pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "We did do that, did not we? And I am so damned proud of it." "Proud of us." "Me too," Helena said softly. "Me too." They stayed there until well past midnight, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. When they finally went inside to bed, they fell asleep the way they always did, wrapped in each other's arms, secure in the knowledge that they were exactly where they belonged. The years that followed were gentle ones, filled with the quiet joys of a life well lived. Garrett and Helena watched their great-grandchildren grow, delighting in their antics and imparting whatever wisdom they had gained through decades of living. They took shorter rides now, their bodies no longer as strong as they once were, but the joy of being together on horseback never faded. They celebrated each anniversary, each birthday, each milestone with gratitude for the gift of more time together. They had seen friends and loved ones pass away, and they knew that their own time was limited, but they did not fear what was coming. They had lived fully, loved deeply, and left a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. On a warm spring morning in their 47th year of marriage, Garrett woke to find Helena still sleeping beside him, a peaceful expression on her face. For a moment he just watched her, marveling at how beautiful she still was to him, how her presence beside him every morning had never lost its power to make him grateful. When she stirred and opened her eyes, finding him watching her, she smiled. "Good morning, my love." "Good morning," Garrett said, leaning down to kiss her softly. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been married to you for 47 years, Helena said with a laugh. "Old and tired and happier than I have any right to be." They got up slowly, bodies creaking with age, and prepared for the day ahead. Thomas was managing the ranch completely now, with help from his sons and the capable crew he had assembled. Mary's school was thriving, educating the children of workers and townspeople alike. James and Samuel's law practice had grown into one of the most respected in Northern California, continuing the advocacy work their parents had started. Garrett and Helena spent their days in simpler pursuits now, tending the garden Helena had cultivated over the years, reading together in the afternoon shade, receiving visits from the endless stream of family members who wanted to spend time with them. They told stories about the old days, passed along recipes and skills and wisdom, and made sure the younger generations understood the values that had guided their lives. On their 50th anniversary, the family threw an enormous celebration that seemed to include half the county. Garrett and Helena, both now well into their 70s, sat in places of honor while the party swirled around them. Speeches were made, toasts were given, and the story of how they met was retold yet again, never losing its power to move people. 50 years, Helena said to Garrett as they danced together slowly, his arms supporting her, her head resting against his chest. "Can you believe it? Sometimes I still cannot believe you said yes to marrying me," Garrett admitted. "I wake up sometimes and I am shocked that you are really there beside me." "I will always be there," Helena promised. "In this life and whatever comes after, you are stuck with me, Garrett Owens." "Best thing I ever got stuck with," Garrett said, holding her closer. They danced until Helena grew tired, then sat together watching their family celebrate. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren filled the house and spilled out into the yard, all of them connected by the love story that had started with a broken whip and a choice to intervene. Thomas stood to speak, his own hair now streaked with gray. "My parents have shown us what it means to truly love someone," he said. "Not just the romance of it, though there has always been plenty of that, but the everyday choice to stand beside your partner, to build something together, to weather the storms and celebrate the sunshine side by side. They have shown us that love is not just feeling but doing, not just words but actions. And because of their love, all of us are here." Every person in this room owes their existence to the fact that 50 years ago, my father chose not to ride past someone in need, and my mother chose to trust a stranger. That is the legacy they have given us, and it is one we will carry forward. The applause was thunderous, and both Garrett and Helena found themselves crying again. They had cried so many happy tears over the years, tears of joy and gratitude, and wonder at the beautiful life they had somehow managed to build together. That night, alone in their room after all the guests had finally departed, Garrett helped Helena undress and get ready for bed, his movements tender and practiced after 5 decades together. "I love you," he said, as he had said thousands of times before. "I love you," Helena replied, as she had replied thousands of times before. And they meant it just as much as they had the very first time, perhaps even more so after all the years and experiences they had shared. They climbed into bed together, arranging themselves in the familiar configuration they had perfected over the years, and talked quietly about the day's events until sleep claimed them both. The years after their 50th anniversary were precious and fleeting. Garrett's health began to decline, his heart giving him trouble, and Helena developed a cough that Doc Matthews's replacement could not quite cure. But they still had each other, still woke up every morning grateful for another day together. They spent their time quietly, surrounded by family, taking joy in simple moments like sitting together in the garden or reading aloud from their favorite books. They repeated old stories and made new memories, determined to wring every drop of happiness from whatever time they had left. One autumn evening, as they sat on their beloved porch watching the sunset, Helena turned to Garrett with a serious expression. "When the time comes," she said quietly, "I am not afraid, because I know I have lived a life full of love, because of you." Garrett took her hand, his grip still strong despite his failing health. "I am not afraid either, though I hope we still have years left together." "Years or days, it does not matter," Helena said. "What matters is that we loved each other well, and we did not we? We loved each other so well." "The best I knew how," Garrett agreed. "You made it easy." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared. The ranch was settling down for the night, the familiar sounds wrapping around them like a blanket. Their children and grandchildren were scattered across the property. Thomas in the house he had built for his own family, Mary in the cottage near the school, James and Samuel visiting with their wives and children. All of it, everything they could see and everyone they loved, had grown from that single moment of choice 50 years ago. From Garrett's decision to intervene and Helena's decision to trust. From their love, which had overcome every obstacle and grown stronger with each passing year. "Tell me again," Helena said, as she had so many times before. "Tell me about the day we met." And Garrett did, his voice carrying across the years, weaving the story of their beginning while the stars shone down and the ranch they had built together breathed peacefully in the darkness. He told her about breaking the whip, about carrying her home, about falling in love with her despite every reason not to. He told her about the moment he knew she was his future, his home, his everything. "And we lived happily ever after," Helena finished when he was done, as she always did. "We really did," Garrett agreed. "We really, truly did." They stayed there until the moon rose high and silver, two souls who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built a love that would echo through generations. And when they finally went inside to bed, they fell asleep in each other's arms one more time, surrounded by the family and the life and the love they had created together, knowing that whatever came next, they had already lived there happily ever after. Their story became legend in Chico and the surrounding area, told and retold as an example of what love could do, how a single act of courage could change not just two lives but countless others. The ranch continued to thrive under Thomas's management, and the Owens family became known for their integrity, their compassion, and their unwavering commitment to justice. Garrett and Helena lived to see their great-great-grandchildren, holding the newest generation in their arms with wonder and joy. They passed away within 6 months of each other, Garrett first and then Helena, both surrounded by the family that was their greatest legacy. At Helena's funeral, Thomas stood to deliver the eulogy, speaking of a woman who had survived the unsurvivable and transformed pain into purpose. He spoke of her strength, her kindness, her fierce love for her family. And he spoke of the love story that had defined her life, the cowboy who had broken a whip and the woman who had trusted him with her broken heart. "My mother once told me that my father saved her life," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. But she always added that he did more than that. He showed her that she was worth saving, that her life had value and meaning. And she did the same for him, showing him that his lonely existence could be transformed into something joyful and full of love. They saved each other, really. And in doing so, they gave all of us the gift of their love, a gift that will continue long after they are gone. The ranch still stands today, run by the sixth generation of Owenses. Each one taught the story of Garrett and Helena and the values they embodied. The broken whip pieces are displayed in a place of honor, a reminder of where it all began. And on warm evenings, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the echo of their voices on the porch, telling each other their story one more time, their love as eternal as the stars that shine down on the land they loved. Their story was not just about rescue or romance, though it was both of those things. It was about choosing love over indifference, compassion over cruelty, hope over despair. It was about two people who found each other in the darkest of circumstances and built a light that would guide generations. And it proved, beyond any doubt, that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings can lead to the most beautiful endings, that love can transform even the most brutal moments into something meaningful, and that a single act of courage can ripple forward through time, creating waves of change that touch lives for decades to come. Garrett Owens and Helena Gibson Owens lived and loved and left behind a legacy that will endure as long as there are people who believe in the power of choosing kindness, in standing up for what is right, and in the transformative power of true love. Their story, which began with a whip being broken forever, ended with a love that would last forever, echoing through the generations and reminding everyone who hears it that the best love stories are the ones where two people save each other,